Hello, it's your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Don't forget to check out and subscribe to my locals. Logos and I are continuing our discussion on the early church fathers. Today we are discussing the Epistle to Barnabas. So, as way of introduction, Barnabas seems to have been an Alexandrian Jew sometime in the time of Trajan or Hadrian. Clement of Alexandria believed him to be the Barnabas of Acts, but Eusebius believed he was spurious. Prior to Clement of Alexandria, there's no extant record of anybody attributing this to the Barnabas. I think a better name for this in that context might be the pseudo-Barnabas, in light of the use of the pseudo-Dionysus to describe a 5th and 6th century writer who claimed to be the Dionysus of Acts that Paul converted, who clearly wasn't due to the time in which it was written. And this work, depending on how you want to say it, was either the middle of the 2nd century, it's like 150 AD, or at the earliest 110 AD. So let's look at chapter 1. Chapter 1. Okay. Barnabas greets his fellow Christians in the love of Christ and declares the object of his letter to communicate to the brotherhood the insights into the faith that he has. He wishes to show them the first fruits of faith as shown by the prophets of old. Okay, so now chapter 2. Barnabas writes that in light of Isaiah 1, 11-14, Jeremiah 7, 22, and Zechariah 8, 17, that God does not accept the sacrifices of the Jews, or rather did not. Possible contradiction here with Hebrews 9, 22. Sacrifice is spiritual. So, yeah, and basically in Hebrews 9, 22, it's the TLDR meaning is without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins, which means you need a sacrifice. Now, he's saying that the Jewish sacrifices have been abolished, which again, classic Christian perspective. Nothing foul here. But what is interesting is that with regards to the broader use of the church fathers in the Catholic Church, we find with sacrifice, he says this. He declares a sacrifice pleasing to God is a broken spirit, a smell of a sweet savor to the Lord. It's a heart that glorifieth him that made it. Now, on the footnote, he said, we read, there is nothing in Scripture corresponding to the last clause. He's quoting here Psalm 51:19. But there are some New Testament verses that I think express the same spirit that the pseudo-Barnabas is using. 1 Peter 2:5, and I quote, you also as living stones are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer a spiritual sacrifice acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Romans 12:1-2, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable in the perfect will of God. And then Hebrews 13:15-16, therefore by him let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of our lips. Give thanks to his name. Do not forget to do good and to share with such sacrifices God is well pleased. So on the one hand, there's a couple interesting things here. If he wants to argue that the sacrifice is spiritual, it's odd that he didn't mention these New Testament passages that I mentioned, unless, of course, he's specifically referring to the Old Testament only. But then I would ask, why would you limit yourself to that? But second of all, it is interesting that, for example, the Catholics would say the Eucharist is a sacrifice. And they would say that there are, the priests perform sacrifices. But notice here, what we would say that the Protestant perspective of the sacrifices being spiritual is exactly what he says it is. And I think this is actually one of the first times so far in the Church Fathers where we've read anybody discuss sacrifice within the context of the Christian life. So I think that's very interesting that we see this with Barnabas. On to chapter 3. He argues from Isaiah 58, 1-10, that the fasts of the Jews are not true fasts, but that the true fast is forgoing evil deeds. We're beginning to hear some of his metaphorical allegorization, which gets progressively worse as we read this. Chapter 4 rather. Barnabas equates Judaism with the Antichrist. He argues that the covenant of promise was not to the Jews, but to the Christians. Now, this is strange, right? Because he doesn't cite Galatians 3:14-22, which is exactly where if this were the Barnabas, companion of Paul, Galatians is already written by now. He would have used Galatians to prove this. But he doesn't. He claims that the Hebrews lost the promise at Sinai with the golden calf incident. In order to be found worthy of the promise, continue to serve God earnestly, lest one fail to attain the hope of glory. But you see, that's very strange because the New Testament doesn't assume that the Jews lost the promise with the golden calf incident. I mean, promises are made to David, promises are made to Solomon, promises are made via the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel to the Jewish people. They don't officially lose it until Christ. And so I think that that's just not a very good exegesis of all of this, and one that modern Christians generally don't adhere to. So there's kind of a bit to talk about here. What are some of your thoughts, Logos?
I think two things I find interesting. I wonder if this is almost as much addressed to the Jews as it is to the Christians. Because if it were addressed to the Jews, a lot of things would make sense. Why is he mostly using Old Testament references, if not completely? Why is he not using Galatians? Well, because if the Jews aren't Christians and they don't take the Christian gospel as as given, then of course it's just going to be Christianity appealing to itself, right? But if there's a hint, or more than a hint, of here's why you Jews are screwing up in this letter, that he's going to have to appeal to it on their own basis. I also read a little bit of the intro to the letter talking about Hadrian and what was going on at the time of the letter, we think. And the author, I got the sense that the author thought the point of this letter was to plead with the Jews to kind of like chill out, or almost as much to plead with Christians not to get sucked into the Jewish conflict with the Romans. And so there's a lot of that in there. And so I get the sense that this letter is a great deal of, let's just suppose the Jews are right about X, Y, and Z. Wait, from their own perspective, here's why this is bonkers, right? If you're not just going to believe us, here's why, at least from their own hand, like they've screwed up. The other thing I found interesting was Antichrist. I thought Antichrist was kind of like a revelation thing. And so I remember reading that chapter 4 and going, wait a minute, man. I thought Antichrist was like end of the world, like a fire, indwelling, left behind kind of crazy stuff. And we're talking about like the Antichrist, way back in, Hadrian's Rome. I figured that part might be something fun you could clarify for me, because how is Antichrist being used here?
Well, that is a good question, right? So in a sort of more general sense in the New Testament, like in, I think it's 1st and 2nd Peter, the spirit of Antichrist is already at work. And the spirit of Antichrist is the denial that Christ came in the flesh, which is not the Jewish claim, right? The Jews claim that Christ is not God, not that Christ didn't come in the flesh. So it's really odd to call Jews the spirit of Antichrist, unless you're referring to a very specific sect of Jews. But again, that would be more of a Gnostic claim that Christ only appeared to have a body. So there's that. But I guess also, is there anything you want to comment about the nature of sacrifice? Chapter 2.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. I mean, just owing to your comments about like why are they appealing to these Old Testament verses? Why are they not using Galatians? Again, I think that was more to the Jews. I'm also wondering. I also have kind of like a conspiracy theory that the reason why he's going so hard after the sacrifice bit in this letter is that he's trying to get Christians to kind of like not out themselves in support of the Jews, especially if they're like in the area. So let's say the Jews are having this problem with the Romans. The Jews feel like legalistically obligated to make these sacrifices, and Barnabas seems to be saying to the Jews, or the Christians rather, that like, we don't have to do this, guys. Like, here's something Christ did. It's just not a good idea for you to be doing this, like spiritually, biblically, or whatever. But I think the meta here is kind of like tactical. Like, you don't need to get like wrapped up in this, Judeo-Roman conflict. We kind of have our own persecutorial problems. Let's not make things more complicated. Seems to be kind of like the undertone here.
Right. Let me just qualify my point about Galatians. So the one I mentioned already, which is the most relevant, Galatians 3:14-22, it's discussing, or from the Christian point of view, clarifying the promises to Abraham. So it's not so much that I'm expecting the pseudo Barnabas to be saying, hey, Paul said this, believe it, but you don't understand Abraham correctly. which is what Paul was basically saying he was writing to the Galatians. But what Paul is saying is that correctly understood, Abraham, the promises to him entailed a lot more than what the Jews of his own day thought. And that's something I'm surprisingly not seeing, if that helps.
Oh, okay. Now I think I understand better. So sometimes I forget a little bit about Paul history because I'm not like a historian or like a theologian. So the idea is that like Paul was a Jew and he actually like went and persecuted Christians and all that stuff. And so when Paul had his like road to Damascus moment or whatever, he ended up kind of like arguing with the Jews, like using their own thing against them. So Galatians isn't like Christian testimony, like here's what Christians believe. Galatians is Paul using Judaism to argue against the Jews of the day, kind of a thing. And so it's like, why wouldn't Barnabas just repeat the already successful arguments in Galatians?
Yes,
got it.
That was my point. And so, continuing on to chapter 5. Barnabas talks about Christ dying in the flesh for our salvation. Barnabas makes a weird allegorical reading of Proverbs 1:17, which instead of the intended meaning of don't lay a trap while the bird is watching, i.e. the bird won't fall into it then, Barnabas reads it as the man who is entrapped perishes for lack of knowledge. Again, this allegorizing thing is a little sus, and it gets worse. Christ really did suffer in the flesh. So again, this chapter, seems more fit for the Gnostics, right? Because the Jews don't deny that Christ came in the flesh. They just deny that he was God.
Right.
So again, that's interesting. Now we're going on chapter 6. The prophets announced Christ in the new covenant. Isaiah announced the cornerstone, which the builders rejected. Barnabas reads the David prophecy, prophesying that he is surrounded by the enemies. And Moses saying the Israelites will eat of the fat of the land is speaking to Christ with regards to his crucifixion and the knowledge of truth, respectively. Okay, I mean, those are typologies that I'll run with, because David is the type of Christ, and throughout the New Testament, there's examples of aspects of David's life being referred to in Christ, and Moses as well. And I think this is pretty tame compared to some of the other. So there needs to be a distinction between typology and allegory. I'll explain that real quick. Typology is where you find repeating themes. So, for example, Christ chooses 12 disciples, which represents the 12 tribes of Israel, right? You're trying to make a symbolic connection. Allegory is where you're trying to find deeper meanings in a passage, even if those meanings aren't there. So, just so we all know what typology and allegory mean, I'll keep going. He then says that man was made in the image of God. Christ is the new man, the second Adam, the new creation. Adam brings Christians into the love of God and the knowledge of his will. Okay, I mean, I think all of these typologically are pretty sound. Nothing too out there at the moment. So I think that's pretty good. Chapter 7. Christ on the cross was a type of a scapegoat. Mosaic sacrifices. Barnabas makes a strange reference to a bush called the rachiah in relation to the scapegoat. Yeah. There's no such bush mentioned in the Bible. So I'm going to read the scapegoat passage, where he's talking about which Christ then is a type of the scapegoat. So scapegoat, Leviticus 16, beginning in verse 8, and I quote, "Then Aaron shall cast lot for the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for the scapegoat. And Aaron shall bring the goat on which the Lord's lot fell and offer it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord, to make atonement upon it and to let it go as the scapegoat into the wilderness." And that's it. They move on to other sacrifices. No mention of a bush. This is very bizarre. There's no mention of a bush. The scapegoat's only mentioned 3 times in the Bible, or just directly, which is Leviticus 16, and there's no bush. And so the whole extended allegory of the bush is just really inexplicable. This guy clearly doesn't understand Jewish ceremonies. And as we'll see as we keep going, this is why I believe this cannot be the real Barnabas. The real Barnabas, being a close colleague of Paul, would never have made these mistakes. Paul, and then whoever the eponymous author of the Hebrews is, didn't make these mistakes with regards to Jewish ceremonies. So now we're going to chapter 8. We're going to see some more of these mistakes, the red heifer. So Barnabas likens Christ to the red heifer. He then goes on a strange typological reading that 3 boys slew the heifer and sprinkled its blood. Okay. let me read about the red heifer now. The red heifer shows up once in the Bible, Numbers 19, verse 2. This is the ordinance of which the law which the Lord has commanded to you, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that you bring a red heifer without blemish, in which there's no defect, on which no yoke has ever come. Continuing, you shall give it to Eleazar the priest, that he may take it outside of the camp, and it shall be slaughtered before him. And Eleazar the priest shall take some of the blood with his finger, sprinkle some of the blood 7 times directly in front of the tabernacle of meeting. Then the heifer shall be burned in his sight. Its hide, its flesh, its blood, and its offal shall be burned. And the priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet. No, there's a 3, but it's not 3 boys. It's wood, hyssop, and scarlet. Cast them into the midst of the fire, burning the heifer. Then the priest shall wash his clothes. He shall bathe in water, and afterwards he shall come into the camp. The priest shall be unclean until evening. No mention of 3 boys. Like, this is complete bonkers nonsense. I don't know how whoever wrote this thought he was going to persuade Jews to become Christians.
Okay, help me out here. What's the deal with the 3? What's the deal with the 3 boys? And what's the allegory or the other thing going on here?
Well, the 3 boys are completely fabricated. There's no context at all with anything in the actual Torah. Now, he wants to then say that these 3 boys correspond to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because they were great with God.
Okay.
But again, so it's almost like he's saying that the Jewish ceremony is, because of the 3 patriarchs, there are these 3 boys that represent them in the sacrifice of the red heifer, but there's not. All that's done by the priest.
Okay, and what you're saying is, like, in the Bible, there are like the 3 different types of wood, and that's where the 3 might come in, but not the 3 boys.
Yeah.
Huh.
And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have nothing to do with the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet. It's this whole this chapter right here is just, this isn't the worst chapter. This is probably the second worst. The worst chapter is coming.
I guess from my perspective, I just have so little understanding of the symbolism. I just don't fully like grasp it. So what's the deal with like the 3 types of wood if they're not referring to the same 3 this guy's talking about?
Well, I don't know if there's a specific typological importance to that.
Oh, okay.
I think we see 3 a lot in the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, because as a Christian, I believe in the Trinity.
Sure.
So I think there's a lot of like foreshadowing, 3, 3, 3. Hey guys, 3 is important, but not in this very specific way that Barnabas is the pseudo Barnabas is using it.
I see. Okay.
So that's what I would say. All right, moving on. Chapter 9, spiritual circumcision. Circumcision is not merely or even solely a physical operation, but a description of one's spiritual condition. God wants an uncircumcised heart to believe and a circumcised ear to hear. The pagan nations were also circumcised, Egypt, Syria, and the Arabs, so that won't save them. It's got to be something more. And then some strange numerology with Abraham at the end. Except for that numerological part, which is a little just strange. He's basically correct. I mean, the idea of with Jeremiah and Paul is the idea that you have circumcise your heart so that you don't sin against God. So most of chapter 9 is consistent with, I think, general Christian typologies.
What does that mean? Circumcise your heart. I don't even understand how visualize what that's asking somebody to do.
Well, yeah. So I think what it means is circumcision was a mark of covenant membership. So it was like if you wanted to be in the tribe, you had to be circumcised, and it meant that it was supposed to be a physical manifestation of a spiritual reality. Your faithfulness committed to God, and so what a circumcised heart, I think, means is it's like, look, guys, you're majoring on the minors here. The real point here is that you have a heart that's directed towards God.
Okay, so it's kind of just like a seal or a shibboleth thing, and not like a physiological metaphor or something. I'm trying to imagine the physiological content of it, applied to the heart, even like a non-physical context, harden the Pharaoh's heart, doesn't literally turn it to stone, but you know what I mean. I just couldn't put it together. So it's just like a seal or just like a brand or something like that, basically.
That's sort of what I'd say. Yeah, that's how I've generally understood it.
Okay.
Because obviously you can't really do that surgical operation with them.
Right.
Yeah. All right, chapter 10. Oh boy, this is the worst. The strange commentary on food. All of Moses' food laws are treated as allegories. I mean, we're not even going to go through all of this, but so rabbits represent pederasty. I mean, this is just bizarre. Let me just go through this. Thou shalt not, he says, eat the hare. Wherefore? Thou shalt be a corrupter of boys, nor like such. Okay, because the hares multiply year by year, this places of its conception for as many years as it lives as it has. Okay. Moreover, thou shalt not eat the hyena. He means thou shalt not be an adulterer nor a corrupter, nor be like them as such. Wherefore, because the animal annually changes its sex, and is at one time male and another female. Well, no, hyenas don't do that. It's both male and female hyenas have testes. And then, moreover, he has rightly detested the weasel, for he means thou shalt not be like those whom we hear of as committing wickedness with the mouth on account of their uncleanness, nor shall it be joined to the impure woman who commits iniquity with her mouth. For the animal conceives by the mouth. I mean, he goes on and on in this vein. It's completely insane. The Bible does use animals as examples, right? Proverbs, the ant works hard. The eagles are a sign of strength and power. David is a lion.
Don't
But
cast pearls before swine.
sure, but this isn't a totally
It's
weird,
bizarre.
bizarre.
I was wondering if you knew, because I was reading this. I didn't catch the mouth thing that you told me about on Discord, right? But I was reading through this. My eyes were kind of glazing over because I'm like, there has to be some kind of secret, like, symbology that Todd knows about here that I have no idea what's going on. So the fact that you're looking at this going, what the hell is this guy talking about, makes me feel a lot better, because I was reading this going, what kind of like crazy like Freemason Jewish conspiracy stuff is he talking about here? Because I've never heard anything like this.
Neither have I. Look, this kind of like bizarro allegory you'll find in the Middle Ages, where like they would try to find all these hidden meanings in like Old Testament passages. Like, I mean, some of the worst examples would be like the Song of Solomon, where there's like actually secretly Christ's love letter to the church. I mean, it gets really bizarre if you read it that way. So, I don't. This is just completely bizarre, and because part of what drives this allegorical reading down the ages is for those sort of like Christians that are more maybe crypto gnostic is the wrong way to put it, but that definitely have this like disdain for a literal reading of the Old Testament. They tend to default to a kind of like pseudo Gnosticism where they just sort of turn it all into an allegory. That way they don't have to worry about the dirty bits like Joshua killing the Canaanites or other things like that. And I think that just creates a lot of problems and just ends up coming out of nowhere. You just kind of pull it out of a hat. And I'm like, no, no. Okay, baptism. Chapter 11, Israel hewed strange cisterns. A righteous man is like a tree planted by the waters. These describe both the waters and the cross. The reference to the tree, which is from Proverbs. Ezekiel prophesies about flowing river of life in trees. I mean, again, I think it's sustainable. I think within certain Christian assumptions, you can sustain these typologies. And notice also the difference between a typology and an allegory is the typology tends to make a more modest claim because typologies are talking about, repeating themes, not so much trying to find, and they're not hidden, right? It's repetition. You just have to see the pattern. It's looking for a pattern that's there, whereas I think a lot of times allegory is trying to find patterns that aren't there. And because there's no actual pattern there, you can get very imaginative and creative. I think arguably one of the strongest chapters is chapter 12 here, where it talks about typologies of the cross. Moses holding up his arms to fight the Amalekites, the brazen serpent, which is Christ. Joshua, of course, in Hebrew, Yeshua is both the name for Joshua and Jesus. And David's son will rule the nations. These are all classic Christian typologies. This is probably the best chapter in the book. 13, Christians, not the Jews, are heir to the covenant. Because this is where it gets a little strange again. So he mentions he appeals to Rebecca. See, he appeals to Rebecca and Jacob, seeming to indicate that the younger will supplant the older, which is a common theme in the Old Testament. as if somehow justifying the fact that Christians supplanted the Jews. But that's just so weird, because the actual allegory or typology that Paul uses is Hagar and Sarah. So from Galatians, which has nothing to do with Rebecca or Jacob. Again, it just seems to be, shoot and miss. He
Talk
also
me through that for a second. So, what's the difference between using this one versus the one that Paul uses?
right. So it looks like, again, that pseudo Barnabas is trying to argue that the Christians are like the quote younger brother that's supplanting the older brother, but Christians are Gentiles, and they're not the direct descendants of any of the patriarchs. Many of them are going to, from like Acts, many of them are European nations, so they're going to be descendants of Japheth. Whereas what Paul is flipping the script, right? Hagar is supposed to be the one without a promise, and then Sarah gets a promise because she has Isaac, and he's saying that to the Jews, you're looking at the mere like physical biological progression. You're missing the point, because Isaac's inheritance is not just one of physical procession; it's one of spiritual procession, which is what we see in chapter 1 of John. And so what Paul is doing is he's basically trying to like really offend the Jews here by saying, no, you're the dirty uncircumcised ones, and we're the actual descendants of Isaac. So the difference is he's not making reference to older and younger sons. He's comparing two women and their children, not a woman who had two sons.
I see. Okay, that makes sense because I don't understand a lot of the Old Testament references. But yeah, trying to claim that the younger supplant the older seems like something that's going to bite Barnabas in the butt, because I'd love for him to observe the Mormon Church or something and see
Aha.
what he'd have to say about like the younger supplanting the older when the
Well, there you
Mormons
go.
were like, now it's us, bro.
Yeah, exactly. And then he mentions at the end of this chapter, Abraham was called uncircumcised, which is what Paul says in Romans 4:10. So this is actually quite good, this last bit here. So he uses Paul correctly in one area, but he doesn't use Paul where he's more obviously relevant. So that's strange, I would say. 14. Let's see. Barnabas argues that since Moses broke the tablets of the law the first time, and Isaiah prophesied the law to come as a light to the nations, Gentile Christians are heirs to the faith. Those are really not good passages to do that. There are other passages, there's one in Isaiah where God says that Egypt and Assyria will later be grafted on to the promise of Israel. There's just much better Old Testament passages he could have used to make this point. This is really going on. Not that I disagree with the point, since he's not really picking very good examples to prove it. It's kind of sloppy, is what I'd say. Chapter 15. Yeah, a lot of this God's creation week. You see this a lot in the early church fathers. They think that because one day is 1,000 years to the Lord, that the earth will last 6,000 years. Well, we're past the timeline for that to have actually happened. Interesting fact, when the Roman Empire in the West fell, many people thought that was the end of the world, because many people still believed in that typology of a day as 1,000 years, and that there'd be 6,000 years. And given the timing from the Septuagint, which had creation at 5,500 BC, the fall of the Roman Empire in the West was right around the end of that 6,000-year cycle, and it didn't happen. So this is an interesting artifact of a bad reading of Revelation and Genesis and some other bits.
So, okay, help me through this for a second. Where do the 6 days come from? I get the days like 1,000 years reference, but where do we see the Earth is only going to last 6 days?
Well, okay, so he's saying that because God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh, that and a day is 1,000 years, that from that we can interpret that the earth will last 6,000 years.
That's strange. So the Earth will only last as long as it took God to create it?
In this in this sort of allegorical sense, right? Because one day is 1,000 years, but yes.
Oh yeah, I mean I take that for granted, no problem. I don't remember ever reading the Bible that God said anything like, as long as it took me to create you, that's how long you shall be, or something like that.
No, he doesn't, and this is another thing too. why you need to avoid making predict. That's why Jesus said, "Don't predict the end of the world," because
Yeah.
nobody knows. Okay,
Right.
so it's just what this is the first list of a long list of black eyes about the end of the world.
Right.
Um, this is the first time we've come across it so far, so we'll just see more of it down to the present day. A Sabbath without a pure heart is not acceptable to God. Yes, we find that throughout the Old Testament, so that's fair enough. Chapter 16. The temple is a spiritual, not a physical building. Barnabas refers to Isaiah 66:1 to argue even in the Old Testament, God did not have or need a temple. A little bit of a strong argument, stronger than it needs to be, but there's a kernel of truth to it. The temple is the Spirit of God living in the saints who form the body of Christ in the church. 16 is mostly good. It's a little strong, and I think that one point, but it's consistent with, again, broader Christian tradition down the ages. 17. Okay, this is just the end of part 1. Simple as. He doesn't talk about future things because they can't understand them and they're hidden in parables. Or maybe pseudo Barnabas just doesn't know how to write because some of that stuff is really weird. Chapter 18, beginning of part 2, 2 ways, one of light, one of darkness. This roughly corresponds to the Didache's way of life and death. Let's see. Yeah, there's the main thing I think that's interesting here is in chapter 19 is a lot of the same Christian morality stuff that we would expect to see. It's fine. He also mentions abortion specifically, so that's important for the debates going on today, and especially Christians, mostly liberal Christians, who want to deny this. It's right here pretty early on, just like in the Didache. And he also says, don't he who serves the rich man is basically a bad guy, which is again a common theme we've seen so far, and completely incommensurate with modern day Christianity. Let's see, chapter 20, again, the way of death, darkness, more or less all the same stuff we saw in the Didache. I don't really think we need to talk about that too much more. And then 21. Conclusion. He says, learn God's word and apply it. God will glorify those who follow his commandments in the resurrection. Barnabas petitions the leaders of the church to listen to his counsel and to keep it, to rule justly over the flock. Barnabas wrote to edify these leaders that they might enforce the commands of God and love the flock. Now, what's interesting here, right? We've just finished a long whole thing with Ignatius and the bishops. Notice how Barnabas refers to church leadership in a way much more consistent with the Didache, Polycarp, and Mathetes, which again, I told you we would expect to see a return to the original treatment of church leadership rather than this bizarre exception we saw with Ignatius. So your thoughts, Logos?
Yeah, I mean, the emphasis here, like whereas Irenaeus would have said, obey the bishop. He says,
Ignatius, you mean?
yeah, Ignatius. Isn't that what I said? Sorry.
You said Irenaeus. We haven't got to him yet.
Shoot. Yeah, the other I one, Ignatius. Yeah. For he who keepeth these shall be glorified in the kingdom of God. So it's more about keeping God's commandments. It's more about keeping your heart right. It's more about the stuff you'd usually expect. It's not about like obey the bishop, like now, I mean, you could do the strained interpretation like we talked about where it's like the bishop is God. So it's just like obey God. It's like, okay, yeah, but people take that a little too far, I think. I beseech you who are superiors, if you receive any counsel of my goodwill, have among yourselves these to whom you show kindness. Do not forsake them. Be good lawgivers. Yeah.
That's completely consistent with the Didache and Mathetes and Polycarp.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, again, the entire point here is be good lawgivers. So that means we should know what a bad lawgiver looks like, right? I beseech to be good. Well, you can only beseech a bishop to be a good lawgiver if there's a bad one, right? Which then goes back to how do you test? Well, we have prior testimony as to how you test for good and bad lawgivers and so on. So this seems to be an uninterrupted tradition, to my mind, about how to deal with that. So,
right. So I haven't read Barnabas in quite a long time, but we do see an immediate return to prior norms of distributed church leadership. And the ambiguities around Ignatius, I think, are largely due to the fact he was interpolated. Now, this brings up a relevant question about Barnabas. I think because he totally misunderstands aspects of the Jewish rituals. This cannot be the Barnabas of who was Paul's companion. He would have known better. He wouldn't have made these mistakes. And second of all, he would have used different verses to prove points, because we know that Paul, in proving the exact same points, didn't use those verses. And in fact, many of the verses he uses don't really speak to those points at all. He's prone to overstating his case. He's prone to making completely wacky allegorical interpretations. Now, the question then becomes, well, what do we do with the elements of the epistle that are pretty sound? And there's quite a few. I think the best explanation, again, is interpolation. The parts of Barnabas that are consistent with everything before Ignatius are true and accurate. The parts that aren't are probably the sign of meddling.
Now, here's a couple questions. You said that a lot of this deeper allegory stuff was done in the Middle Ages. I'm not seeing like a hardcore motive here for the interpolation like we might have seen with Ignatius. There's not interpolation about like the bishops, the hierarchy of the church, and so on. It all just seems to be like really out there allegorical stuff. So do you think this might have been like medievals kind of mucking around with things? Like who would have interpolated this and why? What's the motive here?
Well, right. So let me be clear. While this was common in the Middle Ages, as far as a large intentional literary trend, we see this with Origen. Origen of Alexandria. He's sort of in one sense he's trying to unite Platonic philosophy with Christian theology, as well as having this sort of almost shamefaced relationship to the Old Testament, so you can get rid of all the ugly parts by just making them allegories. In fact, I think Origen is the first guy to argue that the entire war against the Canaanites by Joshua was an allegory for our war against sin in our own hearts. I mean, I'm sure you could read it that way, but it's not at the exclusion of historical events.
Right, that's bizarre.
It is bizarre. So it does generate sometime in the late second, early third century. So it could also be that Barnabas is a very early preview of what we will later get. So, well, they said an Alexandrian Jew, right? Well, that's where all that Platonism was coming in. That's where Origen gets these ideas. So maybe Barnabas, the pseudo Barnabas rather, was one of the first people to do this.
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. Another question I had too is help me set the timeline straight for this, because I know Paul came after Christ, obviously, right? He wasn't one of the 12, but like he met, like, I think it was Peter, right? Didn't Paul meet, like, I think it was Peter and Simon?
Yeah, they knew each other.
Yeah. So I don't think Paul lived like hundreds of years after Jesus' disciples died. And I could have sworn that Jesus would have died somewhere around like 32 AD or something like that. So it seems to me that Paul and Barnabas probably couldn't have lived past 100 AD, thinking about it, if they are contemporaries of the apostles that knew Jesus. So if this was written around like 150, 180, somewhere around there, I don't remember the exact date I saw in the intro, but it was certainly like post 100. It sounds like it certainly couldn't be the same Barnabas. It sounds like there'd be like a 40-year gap between whoever's writing this and the Barnabas that hung out with Paul. That's what I'm reading from it.
Yeah, the earliest date that it could have been was 110 AD, and Paul died in 64, 65 AD. Now, even if we assume that the real Barnabas lived unnaturally long, like say John, and died like in the mid 90s AD, it still doesn't work.
Right.
Now, there was a long tradition, even amongst paganism, to write under the name of a great sage in order to lend credibility to what you're saying. And I think the pseudo Barnabas is an example of this trend. So, for example, with Matthes, which is Greek for disciple, in this sense, he wants to be anonymous, and I can understand why, right? The Romans are going to try to kill you, but he's being anonymous in a way that's humble, because he's referring to himself as a disciple, a servant, and he's referring to it in a general, like, adjectival sense rather than a proper name.
Yeah.
Whereas with the pseudo Barnabas, what we have is this guy's like really trying to cash in. So basically, there's a long line of shysters. There's the pseudo Dionysus who does this. We could also view Barnabas as the first of a long line of shysters who tries to cash in on New Testament Christian names and then try to like use those names in order to garner support for their writings.
Yeah, and putting it all together, it sounds like he's trying to move the needle a little bit toward the more allegorical reading of things instead of the more, I don't know, literal one.
Yeah, I think so too. So I think there's, broadly speaking, there's two theories that I'd float out here. Barnabas is interpolated. All of those passages that are consistent with everything we've read before, excluding some of the stuff from Ignatius, because we would use the same rule for him too, is good. And it's probably what whoever this author really meant. And then some of the really weird, wacky stuff was interpolated later on. That's one reading. Another reading is he could be just one of the first in a long line of shysters who wants to take the name of somebody who came before him to boost his credibility, and one of the first of the Alexandrians to push the allegorical reading, to his readers.
Yeah, I think the second one sounds more likely to me than the first one. With Ignatius, it seems pretty clear that like somebody would have something to gain by really stretching this idea of the bishop and really trying to like set things up to be like, wow, maybe he was like really pro-church hierarchy. There's a hierarchy that has something to gain here. But for this one, like the way you'd mess with it's like so subtle. It'd be like some sect arguing with some other sect about interpretations of some scripture or something. But then if you're getting into arguments or that in the weeds, would you really want to like doctor a church father to make your case there? Like, is that the kind of thing that would help you? It just seems like a lot of effort for not a lot of payoff, given the type of argument this would be used for. Because you're not talking about like a church tradition of authority. You're just talking about like some kind of interpretation.
Well, one possible thing that might support the first claim is a lot like within Christianity. At the time, there was a trend within Judaism to take a more literal reading of the law or a more allegorical reading. So Philo was a Neoplatonist and a Jewish scholar who tended towards a more allegorizing reading. In fact, Philo, many of his methods influenced Origen. So it could be that whoever wants to make these interpolations is trying to appeal to these educated, sort of Hellenized Jews.
Gotcha.
That's a possibility too. But I think that, yeah, Barnabas is definitely a little weird, a little bit of question marks here. But that being said, I think there are also some still useful and accurate passages as well. So when it comes to the church fathers, as I guess with anything, you've got to carefully test out each claim that they're making, because even in like a Ignatius or Barnabas, where you might find some things that are useful and helpful, other things that are not, it takes discernment to divide between the two.
Yeah.
All right. Well, do you have anything else you want to add before we wrap up, Logos?
Nope. I guess I'm glad that this one was shorter than Ignatius was.
Yeah, I bet. We're almost to the philosophers. Almost.
Almost.
This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Five podcast, signing off.